Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the military arrived in force at St. Michael's Hospital in San Diego. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She bent and collected the scattered files from the cafeteria floor while every staff member in the room pretended to study their trays. The manila folders were still warm from her hands. His designer shoe, a $3,200 Ferragamo that probably cost more than her monthly rent, had sent them cascading across the linoleum like leaves. Whitfield watched from his position near the espresso machine, waiting for the tremor in her jaw, the flush creeping up her neck, the moment when she'd finally crack. She picked up the last folder. Straightened. Thanked him with a voice so level it could have calibrated instruments. He walked past without acknowledgement, his shadow falling across her for exactly 2 seconds before the fluorescent lights reclaimed the space. The antiseptic smell of the emergency department clung to her scrubs like a second skin. Danielle Ross had worked trauma units in 2 different continents, and hospitals all smelled the same, bleach and hope and the sharp metallic undertone of human blood dried on stainless steel. She moved through St. Michael's with the kind of invisible efficiency that came from 16 years of training and 9 months of being someone else. Her credentials said registered nurse. Her credentials said Danielle Ross, BSN, transferred from Seattle General. What her credentials did not say was that she worked for Naval Intelligence, that she was a Master Chief Petty Officer on assignment, that she kept a pair of worn combat boots in her locker wrapped in tissue paper like relics. The boots had desert sand still embedded in the laces. They smelled like Tikrit. She did not know that the man she'd carried 2 miles through enemy territory in June of 2011 was sleeping in room 314. The emergency department hummed with its evening rhythm. 3 motor vehicle accidents backed up in the trauma bays. A 12-year-old with a fever climbing toward 104 degrees. An elderly woman with chest pains who kept insisting she was fine, just indigestion, nothing serious, but whose EKG told a different story. Danielle moved between rooms with practiced economy, checking vitals, documenting observations, calling out orders that were not requests because the surgical teams had learned to listen to her, had learned that this quiet nurse caught things other nurses missed. She had a habit of studying charts for a full minute before entering a room, of noticing inconsistencies, of asking questions that revealed mistakes. 3 weeks ago, she'd caught an ordering error that would have killed a post-op patient. 2 weeks ago, she'd flagged a medication interaction that wasn't in the protocol books but showed up clearly in the patient's presentation. Dr. Whitfield had watched her call out an overdose risk in the break room while the attending physician stood there looking embarrassed. That was when he knew the quiet nurse was a threat. She'd been placed at St. Michael's to monitor Major Chris Ventura. That was the operational scope. Watch him. Observe. Note any signs of a security leak within Special Forces medical evacuations, the kind of infiltration that got soldiers killed, that compromised missions, that required someone with clearance and credentials, and the kind of training that taught you to breathe normally while your heart rate sat at a controlled 90 beats per minute. The major had been admitted 4 days ago with what the civilian records called a training accident. What they didn't call it was a traumatic brain injury that had erased approximately 18 months of memory. What they didn't document was that those missing months included a specific operation in Tikrit where everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Room 314 held a man with dark eyes and a military bearing even lying down, his shoulders still squared even in the hospital gown, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, large, contained, ready to move at a moment's notice. Danielle approached with her blood pressure cuff and her neutral expression. The monitors showed a resting heart rate of 63, blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Stable. Healing. She documented without speaking, her pen moving across the chart with mechanical precision, her eyes not lifting to his face because looking at him was dangerous, because his eyes held no recognition, and that absence of recognition was precisely what she had come here to understand. His forearm rested on the blanket, and the tattoo was unmissable, Ross in block letters across his skin, the ink faded slightly by sun exposure and time, placed where he could see it without raising his arm. She had no idea when he'd gotten it. She had no idea how much it meant that he wore her name on his body while his brain had erased her from existence. She checked the fall line. adjusted the monitor leads. Her hand moved with surgical precision, steady as a laser, while something underneath her composure fractured in a way she did not allow to surface. When she spoke, it came out as a question, routine, the kind asked of every post-op patient. "Any pain today, Major?" He turned his head. Made eye contact. Shook his head once. "No, I'm good." She nodded. Turned. Left the room. Her left ear rang slightly, the phantom pain of a perforated eardrum that had never fully healed, that reminded her of its presence whenever stress climbed above a baseline she no longer talked about. The hearing loss itself was 47% in that ear, compensated for by the right, unnoticeable unless someone watched her move toward sound sources, always angling her right shoulder slightly forward. She touched the left ear absently as she moved down the hallway, a gesture so small and quick that anyone watching would have missed it. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and exhaustion. 3 nurses sat at the small table, Relena from trauma, Marcus from pediatrics, and Dr. Whitfield, who had no business being in the break room at 2,100 hours but who kept materializing wherever Danielle happened to occupy space, like a predator testing territory. He held a pen and a notepad, and his voice carried the kind of false camaraderie that preceded cruelty. "I'm taking bets," he announced, his eyes moving between the other nurses with a smile that had never reached past his teeth. "Week and a half. That's my prediction." "The new transfer from Seattle?" "She'll quit within a week. Money on the table right now." "Elena, you in?" Elena glanced at Danielle, who had entered to refill her water bottle from the dispenser. The glance was apologetic. The glance was also the kind that said, "Don't make a fuss, don't react, don't make this worse than it already is." Danielle filled her bottle. Did not acknowledge Whitfield. Did not turn around. The clinical information was available to anyone with access to the staff directory. She was 38 years old, divorced, had a 9-year-old daughter named Sophie, had transferred from Seattle General for unspecified personal reasons. The intelligence briefing had included her civilian cover story, perfect down to the details of her apartment lease and her standing appointment with a therapist who was actually a CIA handler. Whitfield had apparently decided she was vulnerable. Exhausted. Ready to break. He had no idea what break looked like. "Come on, Ross," he said, saying her name with a kind of false familiarity that made every muscle in her jaw tighten into a single hard line. "You look tired. Maybe nursing isn't your thing? Some people just don't have the constitution for emergency medicine." He paused, waiting for a response that never came. "I'm serious. I give you 8 days. Maximum." She turned. Made eye contact. Her voice came out level, with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst thing she could imagine. "I'll take that bet, Doctor." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Perfect. Put it in writing, and we'll call it official." She did not smile. She did not respond. She turned and walked out, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, while something inside her calculated trajectories and leverage points and the precise angle required for a takedown if this situation ever escalated beyond professional insubordination. The boots in her locker could do it. The muscle memory was still there. But muscle memory also meant discipline, and discipline meant she would walk through whatever hell was coming with her face neutral and her hand steady and her eyes forward. What she did not know was that Dr. Whitfield's casual cruelty was not personal. It was strategic. He was protecting something. The billing scheme with the medical supply company, the one where certain procedures were ordered not because patients needed them but because they triggered automatic referrals to a subsidiary that paid him consulting fees, approximately $847,000 per quarter if the numbers held. That scheme required that every staff member be either complicit, incompetent, or transient enough not to notice. Danielle Ross had arrived and immediately started noticing. She'd flagged 3 unnecessary procedures in her first week. She'd questioned a medication interaction that wasn't in the protocol books. She was the kind of nurse who read entire charts instead of glancing at summaries. She was dangerous to the careful structure he'd built. He needed her gone before she figured out that the elevated procedures were not protocol deviations but deliberate profit maximization. He needed her terrified enough to walk away. He did not understand that she was running from nothing. The emergency department caught fire around midnight, not literal fire, but the kind of controlled chaos that came with a mass casualty situation, a structure collapse at a construction site on the north edge of the city, 18 patients incoming, for critical, 2 of them probably not salvageable, the kind of night that separated nurses from people who wore scrubs. Danielle moved through the controlled hurricane with the efficiency of someone who had done this in contexts where the fire was actual fire, where the structures collapsing were concrete and steel and the bodies being rushed toward treatment were soldiers. She anticipated orders before they were given. She positioned equipment where doctors needed it before they asked. She called out concerning vital sign trends in a voice that carried authority despite the hierarchical silence expected of her role. An attending physician named Torres glanced at her twice, confused by the precision of her interventions, by the way she moved like someone trained in triage systems more sophisticated than anything St. Michael's employed. The one thing no one could see was the ringing in her left ear, the phantom pain that now screamed through her skull at sustained noise levels, the physical reminder that some debts were paid in currency that never showed on billing statements. She took a bathroom break around 0300 and pressed her forehead against the cool mirror in the empty bathroom, breathing in the clinical silence of a moment alone. Her reflection was someone else's face, or rather, her own face arranged in the expression of someone else. The Master Chief Petty Officer was still there, visible in the set of the jaw, the calluses on the hands, the scar on her wrist from an extraction that had gone sideways. But the uniform was gone. The rank was silent. The identity was buried so deep that sometimes she forgot it was there at all, until Major Chris Ventura looked at her from a hospital bed with no recognition and she felt the weight of 9 months of invisibility press against her ribs like grief. She touched her left ear and did not allow herself to cry. When she returned to the emergency department, Dr. Whitfield was standing in the medication bay, reviewing discharge paperwork, looking entirely unimpressed by the organized chaos surrounding him. He was protected by structure, by institutional hierarchy, by the simple fact that he had been at St. Michael's for 14 years and she had been there for 9 months. He did not know that she had served 14 years in operational capacity, that she had command authority that would have required him to stand at attention, that she was watching him the way a sniper watches a target, patient, precise, waiting for the moment when trajectory and opportunity aligned. The night wore on. The casualties were stabilized. 2 of the critical patients made it to surgery. 1 did not. The emergency department gradually returned to something resembling baseline. Around 0700, as Danielle finished her shift, Whitfield emerged from his office and made direct eye contact with her across the nursing station. "Still planning to quit?" he asked. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the exit, past the emergency department doors, past the parking lot that was just beginning to catch the first light of morning. Her hand moved to her left ear, that unconscious gesture of testing the boundary between the person she was and the person she was pretending to be. She did not look back. What she did not know was that in room 314, Major Chris Ventura had heard her voice during the chaos of the night, the moment she'd called out orders during a critical resuscitation. His body had recognized something his brain could not access. And something in his fractured neural pathways had begun reaching toward a memory that had been locked away for 18 months, searching for a voice that sounded like every survival instinct he had ever possessed. The file hit her chest with the sharp crack of a gunshot. Danielle caught it reflexively, the manila folder absorbing the kinetic force meant to provoke, meant to shatter. Dr. Whitfield stood 3 feet away during afternoon rounds, his face flushed with the kind of rage that comes from a man unaccustomed to being ignored. The surgical team froze. Nurses at the station looked up from their screens. A resident who'd been trailing Whitfield's wake stopped mid-stride. "This is sloppy," Whitfield said, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire corridor to hear. "Do it again. And this time try to remember you are working at a real hospital, not some wherever you worked before." His smile was a blade. "Charity placements usually don't understand our standards." Danielle's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. Long enough to register the contempt. Not long enough to give him the satisfaction of seeing it land. "Yes, doctor," she said flatly. "Professional. Calm as a ventilator's rhythm." She turned and walked to the nurse's station, the folder still in her hands, her breathing unchanged. Behind her, Whitfield watched for a reaction that wouldn't come. His jaw tightened. He'd learned in the cafeteria this morning, when he knocked files from her hands and she simply bent to collect them in silence, that direct attacks bounced off her like shells off armor plating. The residents had laughed at that moment, one had actually snickered, but Danielle had gathered every page without hurrying, without anger flickering across her face, her movements precise as a surgical instrument. She'd become a puzzle to him. Obstacles that broke usually showed cracks. At the nurse's station, Danielle sat in a hard plastic chair and opened the file. Her handwriting was already flawless, she'd know that, and so would he once he actually reviewed the charts. But she restarted anyway, running her pen across each line with methodical precision. Her left hand trembled slightly. Just a tremor. Just enough that a person watching closely would see the strain beneath the composure. No one was watching closely. 23 years of active duty had taught her to bury everything. The anger, the humiliation, the injustice of standing silent while a man with no honor questioned her competence. 23 years in the Navy, 8 of them classified, and she'd learned that the people who broke first were the ones who let their faces show the war happening inside. Whitfield disappeared into Major Ventura's room on rounds. Danielle continued charting, her pen steady now. The tremor had passed. She could compartmentalize pain with the same efficiency she could insert a central line during code blue. Pain was information. Pain was data. Pain could be filed away and accessed later, or never accessed at all. The choice was hers. The supply closet door closed behind her 5 minutes later with a soft click that sounded like a weapon being holstered. She gripped the metal shelf. Just gripped it. Her knuckles went white, actually white, the blood retreating from her hands as if her body itself was trying to disappear. The metal was cold and smooth under her palms. She pressed down, letting the pressure build in her shoulders, her forearms, her grip. The alternative was screaming. Danielle's eyes closed. Around her were boxes of gauze, rolls of tape, syringes still in sterile packaging. Everything organized. Everything controlled. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead like an insect trapped in a light fixture. The antiseptic smell was so thick it coated the back of her throat. She breathed through it, the way she'd breathed through worse things, through desert air so hot it felt solid, through the copper salt taste of blood that wasn't hers, through the sound of incoming mortars that registered in your bones before your ears caught up. Whitfield didn't understand what he was standing next to. That was almost funny. She released the shelf and stepped back, her hand steady again, her breathing reset to baseline. In the mirror hanging on the back of the door, the one nurses used to check for blood splatter before returning to the unit, her face was blank. Mask intact. The woman staring back looked like someone who'd never experienced anger, never experienced anything at all. When she emerged from the supply closet, the unit had shifted. Shift change was beginning. The day nurses were briefing the evening staff, conversations overlapping in the way hospital hallways sounded, controlled chaos, people moving with purpose. Danielle slipped back into the flow of it, just another nurse in blue scrubs, just another set of hands keeping a machine running that didn't care if those hands trembled or shook or wanted to throw a file back through Whitfield's office window. She had 6 months of undercover work riding on her ability to keep her face blank. Naval intelligence didn't send Master Chief Petty officers to community hospitals to work as floor nurses because they had good bedside manner. She was here to monitor. To watch. To gather intelligence on Major Chris Ventura in room 314, whose body carried recognition that his mind couldn't process yet. The dog tag she wore under her scrubs felt heavier tonight. Whitfield watched her from his office doorway, his fingers drumming against the frame as she moved through the unit with quiet competence. He'd marked her as the type who would crack. They always did. And when they did, he'd have one less person at St. Michael's who actually read charts, actually questioned the procedures he authorized, actually understood medical billing well enough to notice patterns. She would crack. But Danielle Ross had survived Tikrit with a perforated eardrum. She dragged a 210-pound Special Forces officer 2 miles through enemy territory with shrapnel embedded in her ribs. She'd watched her hearing drain away like water from a cup and never once reported it as a combat injury because that would have meant evacuation, and evacuation would have meant leaving Ventura in the hands of people who didn't understand that some patients were classified assets. Whitfield's petty cruelty barely registered on a scale that measured real pain. By the time she pulled into her driveway in San Diego at 8:53 p.m., the sun had already dissolved into the Pacific. Her daughter's backpack was on the porch next to her art projects, a clay bowl from school, still slightly damp, a watercolor of a lighthouse that had been hung on the refrigerator for 3 weeks. Signs of a normal childhood. Signs of a mother who came home at normal times and attended school events and didn't disappear into classified operations that couldn't be explained to a 9-year-old who just wanted to know why her mom smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. Inside, the house was quiet. Her daughter was asleep, the babysitter having put her down at 8. Danielle checked on her anyway, a ritual that never varied. Small body curled under a purple blanket, nightlight casting a soft glow across a face that still looked impossibly young. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat in her scrubs, still damp with the day's labor, sweat and hand sanitizer and something else she couldn't identify, some combination of hospital air that clung to fabric the way certain smells clung to memory. She'd showered at work, as she always did, changing into fresh scrubs. But the day had soaked through anyway. The tears came quietly. Not sobs. Not the kind of crying that made noise. Just tears that tracked down her face while her breathing stayed controlled, while her body remained still. Danielle stared at nothing, at the kitchen wall, at the shadows, at the dark window that reflected her own image back to her like an accusation. 23 years of service. 8 of those in deep cover, in places that didn't exist on maps, doing things she couldn't discuss with anyone except her handler and the ghosts of the people she'd lost during operations. She'd lost her hearing in one ear to an IED blast. She'd lost teammates. She'd lost pieces of herself that no medical discharge could quantify. And now she sat in a dark kitchen in San Diego while her daughter slept upstairs, watching her career dissolve under the casual cruelty of a man who embezzled from the hospital system that was supposed to heal people. But she couldn't tell anyone. Not her handler, because revealing that Whitfield was running a fraud scheme would create noise in the system, would invite scrutiny, would eventually lead back to questions about why a nurse in San Diego was monitoring financial irregularities beyond her station. Naval intelligence needed Ventura monitored. Ventura was still classified. Everything about him was classified. Not the hospital, because that would mean admitting she'd reviewed records outside her scope of practice, which would blow her cover as a regular nurse and raise questions that would trigger background checks that would explode her entire mission. She could tell no one. The worn combat boots sat in the hallway closet exactly where she'd left them that morning, next to her civilian shoes, next to the small talk flats she wore on her days off. Those boots had walked through Tikrit. They'd walked through the worst moment of Ventura's life, the moment when an IED detonated and she was already moving, already between him and the blast, already absorbing impact with her body the way a shock absorber absorbs force. Her hearing had never come back. Danielle reached for her phone. She typed a message to her handler: Whitfield is authorizing unnecessary procedures. Ventura is scheduled for a cardiac catheterization tomorrow morning that his condition doesn't warrant. Fraud scheme. Financial motivation. I need guidance. Then she deleted it. Deleted it entirely. Watched the words vanish from the screen like they'd never existed. Because guidance would mean escalation. Escalation would mean the op changed. And if the op changed, she had to change with it, and she couldn't change anymore. She was stretched too thin. She was holding too many lives together in a system that wanted her silent and small and easy to discard. So she sat in the dark. She would go back tomorrow. She would work her shift with the same flat professionalism. She would keep Ventura safe while keeping her cover intact. And she would wait for whatever came next, because in her experience, what came next was always worse than what you'd already survived. The rain started around midnight, hammering the windows with the kind of intensity that made the whole house sound like it was trapped inside a drum. Danielle didn't move from the kitchen table. She just sat and listened to it, to the percussion of water against glass, to the sound of the world outside continuing on, indifferent to her compartmentalization, to her silence, to the fact that a Master Chief Petty Officer was sitting alone in a dark kitchen wondering how much longer she could hold everything together before one of the scenes finally split. The rain had stopped by the time Danielle's shift began at 0600. She moved through St. Michael's with the precision of someone who had already decided her own fate, that whatever happened, she would be present for it. The hallway smelled like floor wax and ozone from last night's defibrillator use. She restocked the med cart on the 4th floor, her hands methodical, her eyes moving across the patient schedules printed on the clipboard hanging from the automated dispensary. That's when she saw it. Major Ventura's chart. A cardiac catheterization ordered for 0930. Routine, the notation said. Elective. She pulled the chart. Read it twice. The third time she read it standing perfectly still, her fingers gripping the metal edge of the cart so her hands wouldn't shake. A cardiac catheterization on a patient with 0 cardiac symptoms. No chest pain, no dyspnea, no arrhythmia on the telemetry strips taped to his chart. His last EKG was pristine, normal sinus rhythm, no ST elevation, no T-wave inversions. Ventura had walked in for a routine neurological follow-up assessment related to his traumatic brain injury. He was scheduled to see neurology at 1000. Somehow, in the 16 minutes between his admission and his room assignment, Dr. Whitfield had ordered a cardiac procedure on a man with a perfectly healthy heart. She read the order 3 more times. The handwriting was unmistakable. The signature was Whitfield's. Routine elective catheterization, the order stated. Rule out occult coronary artery disease. The phrase sat in her mind like a brick dropped into still water. No indication for it. No echo showing wall motion abnormality. No stress test ordered, no reason to suspect anything was wrong with this man's cardiac system at all. But the catheterization itself was high risk. A thin tube inserted through the femoral artery, threaded up through the iliac, into the aorta, then into the right coronary, then the left main. For a healthy heart, this was damage without purpose. And there were protocols for performing these, standards of care that surgeons were supposed to follow when they actually needed to rule out coronary disease. Rules about technique. Rules about pressure gradients and catheter selection and how gently you had to navigate the vasculature when you were hunting for something that didn't exist. A sloppy procedure could perforate the coronary artery. Could perforate the left main coronary, which supplied blood to the left ventricle, the chamber that drove the entire systemic circulation. She understood then. She understood everything. Whitfield was going to kill Major Ventura. Not in a way that looked like murder. In a way that looked like a complication. A bleeding complication from a procedure that was medically justified, at least on paper, even though everyone competent enough to read charts would know the justification was fabricated. She understood why. Major Ventura had been admitted to St. Michael's 3 months ago with his traumatic brain injury, referred from the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. He was still in recovery, still in the hospital system. He was a witness. Not to Whitfield's billing scheme directly, that would be too obvious, but to something adjacent. To the patterns. To the unnecessary procedures that had become Whitfield's specialty. To the fact that a surgeon who ordered thousands of elective cardiac catheterizations had a billing rate that exceeded his peers by 340%. Someone in Ventura's chain of command had started asking questions. Someone had started looking at the data. And Whitfield must have known. Must have understood that a decorated Special Forces major with a military background might eventually connect the dots if given enough time to recover his cognitive function. Danielle closed the chart. She walked to the operating room scheduling desk and looked at the morning manifest. The cath lab was opening at 0900 for a pre-op check. The procedure was slated for 0930. She had exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes to decide what to do. She could call JG. She could blow her cover, report the fraud, destroy 18 months of accumulated intelligence about what Whitfield had been doing, and potentially compromise an operation that naval intelligence had embedded her inside this hospital to protect. She could save Ventura's life and destroy everything else. Or she could try something else. Danielle walked to the pre-op area and found the nursing coordinator, a woman named Sandra who had worked at St. Michael's for 19 years and had developed the kind of institutional knowledge that hospital charts couldn't capture. "I'd like to assist with the Ventura procedure," Danielle said. Her voice was level. Professional. No inflection. The 0930 cardiac cath. "I'll observe." Sandra looked up from her computer. "You want to observe a catheterization?" "I want to observe this one." "That's not really how we staff the cath lab." "I'm requesting it." Danielle's voice didn't change. This was the key moment. This was where she either became a nurse who wanted to learn something new or a nurse who was doing something with intention. The difference lay in the details. "I want to understand the procedure better. Improve my critical care knowledge." Sandra made a note. "I'll add you to the procedure sheet. But the surgeon will need to approve." Danielle had known that would be the answer. She had planned for it. She walked to the cath lab at 0905, found Whitfield reviewing the pre-op imaging on a monitor, his designer suit already covered with a surgical gown, his hands already gloved. He was humming. Actually humming. Something classical. Something by Vivaldi, maybe. The kind of music that played in expensive restaurants. "Dr. Whitfield," Danielle said. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The kind of calm that comes from having already seen the worst and survived it was the only thing between her and the moment when she would need to act. "I'd like to observe the Ventura procedure." He turned. His eye swept over her the way a man surveys an inconvenience. "No. I thought it would be educational." "Observation only," he said, not looking at her anymore. "Try not to contaminate anything." He turned back to the images on the monitor. That was the dismissal. That was the sound of a man so certain of his position that he didn't even bother to make eye contact when he denied a request. Danielle walked to the procedure room. The cardiac catheterization lab was all stainless steel and digital displays, the monitors arranged in a semicircle around the operating table like the panels in a cockpit. The nurses were already there, 2 of them, both relatively new, both trained well enough to follow orders but not experienced enough to recognize when orders were wrong. They had Ventura prepped and draped. His left groin was sterilized and covered with blue surgical towels. His left arm was positioned for cardiac monitoring. And 4 was already running, normal saline at a TKO rate. They had placed him on supplemental oxygen. His oxygen saturation was 98% on 2 liters. His heart rate was 62 and regular. His blood pressure was 118/76. He was exactly as stable as a human being could be. Whitfield walked in. His presence changed the air pressure in the room the way a storm front changes the temperature before the rain arrives. He was moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a man who had performed thousands of procedures, who had ceased to question himself a long time ago. He positioned himself at the table like a conductor at a podium, and the nurses responded immediately, handing him instruments before he asked for them, understanding his workflow the way musicians understand a piece they've played 100 times. The femoral sheath went in smoothly, a 6 French catheter inserted through the right femoral artery at the groin. Whitfield worked fast. Faster than protocol recommended. Faster than the literature suggested. His hands moved with a kind of aggressive confidence that made every nurse in the room adjust their positioning, sense that something in his energy was off, though none of them could articulate why. The guide wire threaded upward. The catheter followed. Danielle watched the fluoroscopic monitor, the image intensifier showing the tube traveling upward through the iliac artery, then into the abdominal aorta, then beginning its ascent toward the heart. She could see his technique immediately. His wire placement was imprecise. He was relying on his years of experience to compensate for sloppy catheter selection. He was pushing rather than gliding. The catheter was behaving like a dull needle pressed against fabric rather than a delicate instrument navigating a vascular system. 7 minutes in, the monitor spiked. Major Ventura's blood pressure dropped from 118 to 104. His heart rate climbed from 62 to 89. On the fluoroscopic image, Danielle saw the moment of impact, a subtle shift in the catheter position, a sudden backflash of blood. Whitfield had perforated the anterior wall of the left main coronary artery. Tamponade. Pericardial blood accumulating around the heart, compressing it, restricting the ventricle's ability to fill and contract. The clinical presentation was immediate. The monitor showed the pressure drops. The oxygen saturation fell from 98 to 94 to 88. Ventura's body was in shock. His blood was pooling inside his pericardial sac instead of circulating through his system. "Get him upstairs," Whitfield said. His voice didn't change. "Emergency surgery. Now." They moved fast. The crash cart was already there. Someone from the crash team had been monitoring the procedure from the observation window above. They disconnected the monitoring cables and moved Ventura onto the stretcher. His oxygen saturation was 79% now. His blood pressure was barely palpable. The surgical team was being called, but the procedure had happened at 0937 on a Tuesday morning, and the operating theaters upstairs were already in use. ETA was 3 minutes at minimum. The running time to get from the cath lab to the operating suite was 2 minutes. That left 1 minute of buffer before Ventura went into cardiac arrest from pericardial tamponade. They didn't make it. 20 meters from the elevators, 15 meters from the surgical suite, the monitor flatlined. His eyes rolled back. His body went completely limp. The nurses froze. A resident stood there holding the bag like a piece of equipment that had suddenly become incomprehensible. No one moved. No one breathed. Danielle moved. She pushed the crash cart aside and cracked Ventura's chest right there on the linoleum floor of the hallway, her hands ripping open the gown he was wearing, the bone saw coming from somewhere in her body's muscle memory. The sternum split with a sound like a thick branch breaking in the forest. The ribs opened. The pericardium came into view, distended and dark with blood. She opened it. 300 milliliters of blood poured out like water from a tilted pitcher. She was inside his chest now, her fingers literally touching his heart, the organ the size of a clenched fist, sitting in her palm like a piece of his life she had temporarily borrowed. His heart wasn't beating. It was just there. Dead meat. So she squeezed it. Compress, release, compress, release. Direct cardiac massage. Her hands literally pumping blood through his chambers, through his coronary circulation, through his systemic circulation. Performing the function his own heart couldn't manage anymore. She wasn't aware of her own breathing. She wasn't aware of anything except the rhythm. The count. 60 compressions a minute. Her face was completely calm. Her movements were textbook precise. She had done this before, in a firefight in Tikrit, with rounds coming down range and the smell of diesel exhaust and copper blood mixing with the dust. She had done this while carrying a 200-pound man 2 miles through enemy territory with a perforated eardrum and a mission objective that took priority over everything except the human being who had once tattooed her name on his forearm. 2 minutes. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The surgical team arrived. They took over. They moved him into the operating suite. The doors closed behind them. Danielle stood in the hallway, blood on her scrubs, her hand steady at her sides. Her breathing was controlled. Her expression was absolutely blank. From the observation window above the cath lab, Dr. Whitfield watched the entire thing. She saw his face change. She saw the moment when he understood what had just happened. She saw the calculation running behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of exposure, of evidence, of liability. She watched him turn away from the window and walk out of the observation room. Within the hour, her shift supervisor called her into an office on the 3rd floor. Whitfield was already there, sitting in a leather chair with his legs crossed, his designer shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had always treated her fairly, looked like she'd been crying. "There's been a complaint filed," Patricia said quietly, "regarding your conduct during the Ventura procedure." Danielle already knew what was coming. The monitor flatlined at 11:22 a.m. One sound. One decision. Everything changed. Major Ventura's heart had stopped mid-procedure. The needle Whitfield had advanced with surgical arrogance, puncturing straight through the coronary artery like a knife through paper. The cardiologist's hands froze. The nurses stepped back. The surgical team was 3 minutes out, maybe 4 if the elevator was slow. 3 minutes was forever when a man's heart had stopped beating. Danielle heard the alarm and moved. Not walked. Moved. Like muscle memory taking over, like her body was operating on its own command frequency while her mind stayed perfectly clear. The crash cart was already rolling. She'd been standing at the edge of the procedure room, watching, always watching, and she was through the doors before Whitfield even turned around. "Step back," she said to the cardiologist, and there was something in those 2 words that made him obey without question. Her voice didn't sound like a nurse's voice anymore. It sounded like someone used to giving orders in firefights. She looked at Whitfield once. Just once. His face was already pale, already understanding what he'd done. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Instead, she called out the time, 11:48. Ischemia clock started. The hallway felt smaller suddenly, the fluorescent lights too bright, the air tasting like antiseptic and failure. 2 nurses were moving with her, younger ones, good instincts, and she gave them their assignments in that same command voice: "Get me a crash cart. Full setup. Betadine and drapes now." The gurney was already moving toward them. They'd taken Major Ventura out of the catheterization lab and into the hallway because there wasn't time for the operating room. There was barely time for breathing. Danielle's hands moved across his chest, locating the landmarks, the 4th and 5th intercostal spaces, the anterior axillary line, the same way she'd located shrapnel in hostile territory 9 years ago. The same anatomical map, different uniform. Her fingers found the spot where she needed to be and she didn't hesitate. "Scalpel," she said, and a nurse pressed it into her palm like they'd done this together 100 times instead of 0. The incision opened his chest in one clean line. The sound of ribs cracking came next, not from instruments, but from her hands. Direct cardiac massage. Old school. Brutal. Effective. She reached in, her gloved hand closing around his heart, and started squeezing. Not pumping. Squeezing. Like she was trying to remind it how to work, how to push blood to his brain, how to keep him alive for the next 90 seconds. "O2 sat?" she asked. 32 and dropping, a nurse answered. "That's not acceptable," Danielle said flatly, and she didn't know if she was talking about Ventura's oxygen level or about the fact that Whitfield had ordered this procedure in the first place, the unnecessary invasive procedure on a recovering officer for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with covering his tracks. "Epi pushed? 1 milligram 60 seconds ago." Her hand kept squeezing. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The rhythm as steady as a metronome, as measured as she could make it while his blood moved through her fingers. She could feel the structure of his heart, the chambers, the valves, and she could feel it starting to respond, starting to remember how to work without her assistance. ETA surgical. 2 minutes. 1. More. Minute. She squeezed harder, felt the resistance of his ribs, heard the sound of his heart starting to generate its own electrical activity again. The monitor beeped. 1 beat. Then another. Then a rhythm that looked almost sinus, almost stable. "We've got a pulse," someone said, and Danielle kept squeezing because you don't stop until the surgical team has him, until he's under anesthesia in the OR with professionals who could finish the job she was keeping alive. The surgical team burst through the doors at 11:52, 8 minutes from code to handoff, 8 minutes that would be the difference between a dead Special Forces officer and one who might actually live to remember his own name. They were moving fast, professional, and she stepped back in the exact moment they took over, her hands coming out of his chest with the precision of someone who knew when to lead and when to yield. Blood on her gloves. His blood. The same blood that had mixed with hers in a firefight 8 years ago in a place where the sun made the concrete blister and people died for reasons they'd never understand. "Good work, Master Chief," the senior surgeon said, and Danielle felt her entire body go still because he'd just called her by her rank in a hallway full of hospital staff, and that meant he knew that there was no ambiguity anymore about who she was or what she'd done. She didn't respond. She peeled off her gloves and turned toward the recovery area where she was supposed to be cleaning up when the administrator's office called. Within the hour, the trap had sprung. Danielle stood in the administrator's office, a room that smelled like leather and money and the kind of air conditioning that came from somewhere other than public hospitals, and 3 men looked at her like she was a problem that needed solving. 2 of them had the soft hands of board members. 1 had the tired eyes of an investigator. "Miss Ross," the administrator said, deliberately not using her title, the same way predators avoid eye contact before the strike. "We've received serious concerns about your conduct this morning." Major Ventura was in cardiac arrest, she said simply. The surgical team was 3 minutes out. "You cracked open a patient's chest in a hallway," one board member said. His voice had that rehearsed quality of someone reading from a script Whitfield had provided. "Without supervision. Without authorization. In violation of every protocol this hospital maintains." Danielle said nothing. Silence was its own kind of statement. The investigator, a woman named Chen with reading glasses and a recorder, tapped her laptop screen. "Your employment records are interesting, Miss Ross. Significant gaps in your work history. Your references are minimal. Your credentials come from institutions that are somewhat difficult to verify." This was the pivot point. This was where Danielle had to choose between defending herself and protecting the mission. She could explain the gaps: 3 years training with naval intelligence, 2 years embedded with JAG, the certified credentials that were real but issued through classified channels. She could show them the documents hidden in her apartment in a safe deposit box that the Navy never wanted her to produce unless she was testifying under subpoena in a closed hearing. She could burn everything. "I have nothing to add," she said instead. The administrator slid a document across the desk. "Termination letter. Effective immediately. Cause listed as unauthorized medical intervention and employment history irregularities." There were probably other things listed in the fine print, things designed to prevent her from ever working at another hospital without detailed background investigation. She signed it without reading the rest. The security guard, a veteran in his 60s with a tight jaw and eyes that recognized something in her own gaze, took her badge at the front desk. His hand trembled slightly. He didn't say anything, but she saw the moment of understanding cross his face. Saw him realize that he'd just escorted someone important out of a building, and that someone had let him do it without protest because the alternative was worse. She carried a small box of personal items through the automatic doors into the San Diego afternoon. The sun was brutal, the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer like water. A helicopter passed overhead, a Black Hawk, she could tell from the rotor signature alone, and she didn't look up because looking up was a habit she was supposed to have lost 9 years ago. At home that night, she sat at her kitchen table in the dark. Still in her scrubs. The termination letter in front of her, the words blurring because her hands were shaking now, finally shaking, now that there was no one to see it. Her daughter was asleep down the hall. The apartment was silent except for the sound of the refrigerator compressor cycling on, the fluorescent buzz of the streetlight outside, the distant sound of sirens moving through the city. She reached into the closet and pulled out the combat boots. 9 years old. Scuffed. Still stained with dust from Tikrit. The same boots she'd been wearing when she dragged a 200-pound Special Forces officer through 1,800 meters of hostile territory with an IED ringing in her ears and her left eardrum perforated and blood mixing with sweat until she couldn't tell where her injury ended and his trauma began. The same boots that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. The same boots that were about to change everything. She was still staring at them when her daughter found her at midnight, the small body padding into the kitchen in bare feet and a nightshirt. "Why are you home early, Mom?" Danielle had no answer that didn't require explaining a life she'd hidden for 9 years. She had no answer that didn't lead to classified information and official secrets and the reason why certain people at the Navy Department had placed her in St. Michael's in the first place. She had no answer except the truth, and the truth was about to arrive in approximately 18 hours whether she was ready or not. The next morning, Dr. Whitfield walked through the St. Michael's lobby at noon reviewing surgery schedules on his tablet, his designer shoes clicking against the polished floor, and something on the television caught his attention. A news broadcast. A human interest story. The headline read "Missing Decorated Combat Medic," and below it was a military photograph, younger face, dress uniform, rows of ribbons that told a story of deployments and injuries and acts of valor that no one in this hospital was supposed to know about. The photograph was Danielle Ross. Whitfield's hand went slack. The tablet fell. The sound of it hitting the floor was loud enough that people turned to look at him, but he didn't notice because the automatic doors were opening and Major Chris Ventura was walking in flanked by 2 Marines in dress uniform, his arms still in a sling, his face steady as concrete. "That's Phantom," Ventura said, pointing at the screen. The security guard, the veteran who'd taken Danielle's badge yesterday, snapped to attention so fast his chair rolled backward. His voice came out shaking, "Master Chief Petty Officer. Silver Star recipient. Purple Heart." Then the general arrived. A 2-star general in full dress blues strode through the entrance reading from a service record, his voice carrying like a parade ground announcement through the entire lobby. Hospital staff emerged from every corridor, every floor, stopping work to listen. Master Chief Danielle Ross. 3 combat deployments. 12 lives saved under fire in Tikrit. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Combat Action Ribbon. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old milk. Ventura rolled up his sleeve to show the Ross tattoo, the ink clear and deliberate and permanent. His voice broke. "She lost her hearing in her left ear when an IED detonated 6 feet away. She used her own body to shield mine. Then carried me 2 miles through enemy fire with a shattered eardrum." The silence was absolute. You could hear the ventilation system, the electrical hum, the sound of someone's pager vibrating somewhere in a distant floor. The general continued, "Master Chief Ross has been operating under classified orders, monitoring security protocols in military medical evacuations. Her position here was cover for a naval intelligence operation." Then he turned directly to Whitfield. "Dr. Whitfield, you are hereby stripped of access to military patients and personnel at this facility, effective immediately." 2 federal investigators in civilian suits stepped forward, real ones, with credentials that made the board members go pale. "We'll also be discussing certain billing irregularities that came to our attention during Master Chief Ross's monitoring activities. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." The lobby television flickered at 11:16 a.m., the noon news anchor's voice crisp and professional as Danielle's military photograph filled the screen in full color, dress blues, hair pulled back, silver star visible on her chest. The chyron scrolled underneath in white block letters, "Missing Decorated Combat Medic, Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross." Dr. Whitfield stopped mid-stride. His designer shoes, the ones that click so deliberately on linoleum, went silent on the marble floor. His hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. Around him, the lobby hummed with ordinary chaos, phones ringing, families waiting, the automatic doors sliding open and closed like breathing, but his world had contracted to the size of that screen. The anchor was describing Tikrit. Describing an IED detonation. Describing a combat medic who'd shielded a special forces major with her own body. Whitfield's face went the color of old bone. The doors burst open with the force of a man who moved through the world like apex predators move through brush, no hesitation, no apology, just forward momentum. Major Chris Ventura stood in the entrance flanked by 2 Marines in dress uniforms so sharp they could cut glass, and his voice carried across the lobby with the precision of someone trained to be heard over rotor wash and chaos. "That's Phantom." The word hung in the air like a challenge. 300 people turned. Visitors, staff, administrators, orderlies, every face tracking toward Ventura, then toward the television, then toward the space between them where understanding began to crystallize. The security guard who'd escorted Danielle out yesterday, the one with the uncomfortable eyes and the apologetic jaw, snapped to attention so sharply his badge clattered against his chest. His voice shook like a man who'd just realized he'd kicked a landmine. "Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Silver Star recipient. Purple Heart." The silence stretched. Whitfield's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble, liquid spreading like a stain he couldn't clean up. The general entered through the main entrance, a two-star with ribbons that told stories of 3 decades in uniform, his presence making the air pressure change like a storm rolling in across open water. His voice was steady, measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst this world could offer. "Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. 9 years Naval Medical Corps. Deployed to Afghanistan 4 times. Deployed to Iraq 3 times. Tikrit engagement, June 2016. He read from the citation in his hands without looking at it, as if he'd memorized every word. Direct cardiac massage in the field. Combat wound triage under active fire. 2 miles of enemy territory. Shielding the casualty with her own body. Whitfield's back pressed against the wall. His mouth opened and closed without sound. Major Ventura rolled up his sleeve, and there it was, her name in black ink across his forearm, Ross in capital letters worn soft by 9 years of living with it. His voice broke open like something fragile. She lost her hearing in her left ear. When the IED detonated. She was on top of me. Took the blast instead of me taking it. He looked directly at Whitfield. Then she carried me. 2 miles. Alone. While I was barely conscious. While the world was still exploding around us. Ventura's jaw clenched. She did that for honor. For the mission. For the man next to her. The general turned. Movements precise, economical. Dr. Pierce Whitfield. Whitfield nodded, a gesture too small to matter. "You're terminated. Your hospital credentials are revoked effective immediately. Your cases are under federal review." The general's hand moved like a surgeon's, sharp, final, decisive. The credential badge came off Whitfield's neck in a single gesture. The plastic lanyard fell to the marble with a sound like ice cracking. "You'll surrender your medical license to the state board within 72 hours pending the outcome of the fraud investigation." The news cameras had been outside since 10 a.m., but they flooded through the doors now, following the wake of authority and consequence. Whitfield's face went pale, then white, then a shade that had no name, the color of a man watching everything he'd built collapse at once. Reporters' voices overlapped, questions firing like rounds. "Dr. Whitfield, did you know about her service? Why did you fire a decorated combat veteran? Can you comment on the billing investigation?" He had no answers. His attorney had told him to stay silent, but silence under camera lights looks like guilt. It looks like shame. It looks like a man who knows exactly what he's done. By evening, his name was trending. The medical board announced an emergency review of all procedures he'd authorized in the past 3 years. 17 unnecessary surgeries. 42 unnecessary cardiac catheterizations. Inflated billing records totaling $340,000. Kickbacks from the medical supply company totaling $89,000 more. The golf buddies stopped returning calls. His wife began receiving inquiries from reporters. Board members who'd approved Danielle's termination suddenly claimed they'd been misled, that they didn't understand the full context, that they would never have agreed if they'd known. One resigned within hours. Someone had recorded the moment he threw Danielle's chart at her chest during rounds. The video surfaced on social media that afternoon, 11 seconds of him winding up like a man throwing a baseball, her catching it without flinching, his face twisted with contempt, her expression flat as concrete. By evening, 200,000 shares. By midnight, the cafeteria incident circulated, his voice calling her sweetheart, the files scattering across the floor, her bending to collect them while he watched. The bet in the break room. The dismissals. 9 months of documented cruelty committed in front of witnesses who'd finally found their courage. The medical supply company executive flipped within 48 hours, providing documentation of the arrangement. Criminal charges filed. Whitfield's medical license suspended pending investigation. The teaching job came 3 months later, at San Diego Community College, minimum wage, the kind of position that requires a man to demonstrate CPR compressions on a plastic dummy while students young enough to be his children texted under their desks and didn't listen. 3 weeks after the reveal, Danielle returned to St. Michael's in her Master Chief uniform. Not as a nurse. As a symbol. As a reckoning that came wearing dress blues and carried the weight of every sacrifice no one had witnessed. The hospital had dedicated a veterans care wing in her honor. The auditorium filled with staff, nurses and doctors and orderlies and administrators who'd worked beside her without knowing who she actually was. Major Ventura sat in the third row, his memory gradually returning in fragments. He'd begun remembering pieces of Tikrit in his dreams, the feel of her voice more than the words themselves, the sensation of being carried through darkness, the knowledge that someone had chosen him over herself. Her daughter sat in the front row, finally understanding. Understanding why her mother kept combat boots in the hall closet. Understanding why certain sounds made her pause and touch her left ear. Understanding what it meant to love someone enough to break yourself for them. Danielle stood at the podium without notes. Her voice had transformed, no longer deferential, no longer small, but steady and commanding, the voice of someone who'd survived things most people couldn't imagine. I didn't save Major Ventura for recognition. I did it because it was right. That's what we do. In combat. In hospitals. Wherever we serve. She paused. The auditorium went silent, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song, the air conditioning cycling through the vents, 300 people breathing in unison. Dr. Whitfield taught me something important. Cruelty often masks fear. He was afraid of competence. Afraid of integrity. Afraid of anyone who threatened the kingdom he'd built on fraud. Her eyes swept the room, and people wept openly now, nurses dabbing their faces with tissues, doctors staring at their hands. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The auditorium erupted. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from witnessing something true finally being spoken aloud. The kind that sounds like forgiveness for not protecting her sooner, like recognition of what had always been there beneath the scrubs and the humility and the perfect composure. After the ceremony, she stood with Major Ventura by the window. He studied her face like a man reassembling a broken thing piece by piece. I remember your voice, he said quietly. In Tikrit. You kept talking to me. Kept saying, stay with me, Major. Just stay with me. She nodded. Her daughter held her hand, small fingers warm against her palm. You stayed, Danielle said. Behind them, in a shadow box mounted on the white wall, her worn combat boots were displayed, the pair she'd been wearing in Tikrit, the sole scuffed from 2 miles of carrying a man twice her size through enemy territory. Donated to the Veterans Wing. A permanent reminder that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength, like this video and subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes revealed. Comment below, would you have stayed silent, or would you have let the truth find its way into the light?